The prairie had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the moan of the wind as it dragged across the wide and empty land. Out here, miles from the nearest town, even the smallest creak of wood or rustle of grass could make a person feel watched. She had lived with that silence for years, a woman alone in a house her late husband had built with his own hands. The roof sagged in places, the boards of the porch groaned, but it was still standing, much like she was. Solitude had become her daily bread, and the rhythm of survival had carried her from one season to the next. She rose with the sun, carried buckets of water from the well, chopped wood, fed her hens, and kept her fences mended. The days were hard, but the silence was harder. At night, when the lamps were out, she sometimes sat near the window and listened to the coyotes yipping in the dark. There was a strange comfort in their calls, as if some living thing out there was reminding her she wasn't the only soul alive beneath the endless stars. Yet the silence always returned, heavier than before, pressing on her until she felt it in her bones. Folks in town whispered about her, saying it wasn't natural for a woman to stay on a ranch by herself. But she had grown used to the whispers, just as she had grown used to loneliness. Out here, the only company that mattered was the land, and the land gave her everything she needed, even if it asked for her strength in return. One evening, as autumn settled and the air grew sharper, she stood outside stacking wood for the stove. The sun bled across the horizon, turning the sky into a wash of fire and gold. She wiped the sweat from her brow and thought of the coming winter. It was always a battle snow piling against the door, food running thin, the cold pressing in through every crack in the walls. Still, she was determined to make it as she always had. She carried her last load of wood inside and was about to bolt the door when she heard it, the sound of hooves, heavy and slow, carrying more than one rider. Her heart kicked hard in her chest. No one came out this way without reason, and most reasons weren't good. She snuffed the lamp and stood in the shadow of the window, peering out into the dusk. At first, she thought her eyes deceived her, for what came up the trail was no ordinary traveler. A tall figure rode at the front, broad-shouldered, his dark hair tied back, the outline of his body unmistakably that of a giant. Beside him, or rather slumped against him, was a frail older woman wrapped in a faded blanket. Their horse labored under their weight, but the man kept his posture steady, as if the animal's strain was his own. She had heard stories of Apaches roaming these parts, proud and fierce, keeping to themselves unless wronged. Fear sparked in her gut, yet so did something else: curiosity, maybe even pity. The man's presence was commanding, but it was the way he bent slightly toward the old woman that caught her eye. He wasn't a raider, at least not now. He looked like a son carrying the last bit of his world on his shoulders. She stayed still, hand resting on the latch of the door, unsure whether to bar it or open it. Her mind raced through warnings she'd heard in town. Don't let strangers in, especially not Indians, not when you're alone. Yet the horse stopped before her gate, and the giant of a man swung down, lifting the frail woman into his arms as if she weighed no more than a child. He didn't storm to her door or demand entry. Instead, he stood in the cold air, his voice low and steady. "Can we stay one night?" The words carried across the space between them, simple yet heavy. She had not heard a man's voice spoken to her in years, and the sound of it stirred something she thought had gone quiet long ago. The question hung in the air, and with it came a storm of thoughts she could not quiet. Was it safe to let them in? Could she turn away a mother shivering in her blanket? Could she face two pairs of eyes staring into the dark, asking for nothing more than shelter? Her pulse drummed as she studied them. The giant did not move closer, though she could sense the strength in him, a strength that could have taken what he wanted if that had been his intent. Instead, he waited, still as stone, his burden cradled gently in his arms. The old woman coughed, a dry rattle that seemed to carry years of dust in it. That sound broke through her fear more than anything else. She had lived alone so long, but she had not forgotten what it meant to hear someone suffer. The wind cut sharper, and she felt the chill creep under the door. Her mind argued with itself. Letting them in could change everything, but denying them could leave her with the memory of turning away a mother and her son into the night, perhaps into death. She had always believed the land tested those who lived upon it, and maybe this was one of those tests. The man lifted his head, his gaze steady on her window, though he could not have seen her in the shadows. She felt as though he could read her hesitation, could see into the storm of doubt twisting inside her. Something about his stillness unnerved her, yet it was not the kind of unease born of danger. It was the unease of facing a choice that might alter the course of her life. Her hand trembled on the latch, her breath caught in her throat. The silence pressed in again, but this time it was filled with the weight of waiting, of something about to break. She had lived alone for so many years, walled off from the world, believing she needed no one. Now, in the space of a single question, all that certainty began to shift. The horse pawed at the frozen ground. The old woman stirred weakly in her son's arms. The giant did not repeat himself, did not plead, did not demand. He simply waited, tall and immovable against the dying light, holding everything he had left in the world. Her heart thundered as she finally loosened her grip on the door. She took one slow step toward it, unsure whether she was opening the way to safety, to danger, or to something else entirely. The wood creaked under her hand as she eased it back. The smell of the cold night rushed in, carrying with it the weight of a choice she could not undo. And as the door gave way, the man's dark eyes lifted, meeting hers for the first time. They were not the eyes of a stranger seeking to take, but of a man carrying years of hardship, loss, and unspoken stories. Still, that did not answer the question beating inside her, whether she was letting in salvation or ruin. The night seemed to hold its breath, and she, too, stood suspended, caught between fear and something she could not yet name, as the giant Apache waited for her answer. The door stood half open, and the cold air swept in, brushing against her face like a reminder that she had crossed a line she could never step back from. The man remained outside, silent and watchful, while the old woman shifted weakly in his arms. For a heartbeat she thought about shutting the door again, retreating to the safety of her solitude, but her eyes caught the way the older woman's hand clung faintly to her son's shirt. That hand looked so fragile, its skin drawn tight over bone, as though the life in it could be carried away with the wind. Something inside her softened, and she stepped back, her voice quiet but firm. "You can bring her in." The giant inclined his head once, not in triumph, not even in relief, but as though he had expected no less of her. He bent down, ducking under the low frame of the door, carrying his mother with a carefulness that struck her as strange for a man of his size. His presence filled the room, the firelight catching on his face, showing lines of wear and travel, dust clinging to his hair and clothes. She noticed the old woman's breath, faint and shallow, and hurried to stir the fire higher. The man laid his mother on the narrow cot against the wall, tucking the blanket close around her. The frail woman murmured something in a language the rancher woman did not understand, but the son bent low, listening as if every word were worth more than gold. He answered softly in the same tongue, his deep voice gentle in a way she would not have believed possible from such a towering figure. She kept her distance, her hands tight around the poker as she shifted the logs in the stove. The fire sparked, warming the room, but her nerves stayed cold. It was one thing to open the door. It was another to have him standing there, his shadow stretching across her floorboards. "You live here alone," he said at last, his words measured, more observation than question. She nodded but did not answer. She was not ready to hand over her truths to him, not yet. He did not press her. Instead, he pulled off the worn leather strap that had been slung across his chest, setting down a small bundle near the door. She could see a bow lashed together with sinew and a quiver half empty of arrows. A knife hung at his belt, its blade worn but well cared for. He was armed, though she realized with a jolt that if he had meant her harm, the moment of asking permission would never have come. Still, her heart drummed in her chest, caught between instinct and something she could not name. She moved to the shelf and fetched a clay cup, filling it with water from the pitcher. When she handed it to him, her fingers brushed his for only the smallest instant, yet it felt like more than she wanted. He gave the water to his mother first, lifting her head so she could drink. Only after she had swallowed did he take a sip himself. For a time the room was quiet, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the soft breaths of the woman on the cot. The lone rancher studied them from where she stood. Questions circled her mind like restless birds. Where had they come from? Why had they stopped here, of all places, when they could have passed her homestead by? And what weight of story did the sun carry behind those dark eyes that seemed to hold too much silence? The old woman slept at last, her chest rising in shallow rhythm. The man pulled a stool near the stove and sat with the ease of someone who had spent long hours in the saddle. His hands, broad and rough, rested on his knees, but his gaze wandered around the room as though he were measuring more than the space. "You keep this place strong," he said finally. "Most men cannot keep a house from falling in." Her breath caught at that. It had been years since anyone had spoken of her labor with respect, and coming from him, the words carried a weight she could not easily shake. She turned away, busying herself with the pot on the stove. "It holds," she muttered. "That's all that matters." The man studied her a moment longer, then looked back at his mother. His face gave away little, yet there was a tightness in his jaw, as though something pressed heavy on his thoughts. She wanted to ask, but pride held her tongue. Out here, questions could be dangerous things. Instead, she listened to the quiet, her nerves still on edge. The land outside stretched wide and unforgiving. No rider came this way by chance. And though she had let them in, she could not quiet the fear that followed behind them like a shadow. Hours passed. The fire burned steady, the room warm despite the bite of autumn outside. She thought of her neighbors, miles away, of the town farther still. If they knew an Apache and his mother were under her roof, what would they say? What would they do? Out here, suspicion could rise as quick as prairie fire, and she had no wish to be caught in its path. The man broke her thoughts with a low voice. "Tomorrow we will go. We ask nothing more." His words eased her a little, though not completely. She glanced at him, at the quiet way he spoke, not demanding, not apologizing. He said it like a man who had already learned to carry hardship without complaint. But still, the question burned. Why had they come here? Why her house, her lonely stretch of land? She considered asking, then stopped. Instead, she moved closer to the stove, sitting across from him, though still keeping space between them. His presence was unsettling, but in a way that stirred her more than frightened her now. "You've traveled far," she said carefully. He inclined his head. "Far enough." That was all he gave, and the silence that followed seemed deliberate, as though he had drawn a line she could not yet cross. She wanted to push, but she saw the way his eyes flicked to his sleeping mother, and she held back. Some truths, she realized, were guarded like treasure. The hours wore on, and at last she rose to fetch a blanket from the chest. She set it near him, saying nothing. He accepted it with a nod, laying it across his broad shoulders. She retreated to her own room but could not sleep. Through the thin wall she could hear the faint stir of movement, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke softly in his mother's tongue. She lay awake, listening, feeling something shift inside her that she could not name. Morning came gray and cold, the first light creeping across the plains. She rose early, as always, stepping outside to the frost-dusted yard. The world felt sharper, clearer, as though the night had changed the air itself. When she returned, the man was already awake, tending to the fire with the ease of someone used to such work. His mother still slept, her breathing steady, though faint. He glanced up as she entered, his eyes meeting hers with the same quiet steadiness as before. "You gave us shelter," he said. "For that, we owe you." She didn't answer right away, for her thoughts tangled with unease and a strange stirring she could not explain. She had lived so long without voices in her home that his words seemed to echo louder than they should. And somewhere deep within, a question kept repeating itself: what price came with opening her door to strangers? And what kind of story had she stepped into by letting them cross her threshold? She poured water into the pot, her hand steady though her heart was not. The fire crackled, the frost began to melt outside, and still the unspoken hung between them, heavy as a storm on the horizon. And in that silence, she knew the test of her solitude had only just begun. The morning stretched quiet across the homestead, though it did not feel like the kind of quiet she had grown used to. For years, silence had been her constant companion, filling every corner of her house, pressing on her chest at night, lingering like a shadow in the day. But now the silence was different, strained, as if it were only holding itself still until something gave way. She watched the man kneel near the stove, his broad shoulders bowed as he added wood to the flames, and she felt her skin prickle with unease. It was not just his size or the knife at his belt that unsettled her, but the weight of everything unspoken between them. His mother stirred weakly on the cot, her thin frame shifting under the blanket. He moved to her side at once, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he smoothed the cloth across her shoulders. The care in his touch tugged at something deep inside the woman who watched him. She knew the kind of devotion it took to tend to someone who could no longer care for themselves, the endless patience it required. Yet she also knew the toll it could take. The old woman muttered in her own tongue, her words rough and uneven. The son bent close, listening. His reply was soft, almost a whisper, and though she could not understand their language, she understood the rhythm of love in it. For a moment, the hard lines of his face eased, but when he straightened again, his expression had closed, the silence between them thickening once more. She tried to turn her thoughts back to her daily tasks, but her hands moved slower than usual. The chicken scattered at her feet, the water in the bucket sloshed against her skirts, yet her mind stayed fixed on the strangers inside her home. She had let them in for one night, but one night had already stretched into morning, and she sensed it would not end there. When she returned, he was waiting at the door. His dark eyes studied her with that same steady gaze that seemed to strip away any attempt at pretense. "There are men on the trail," he said simply. Her breath caught, and she froze with the bucket in her hands. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head toward the horizon. "I saw smoke when we came. A camp. Close enough to reach here." Fear rippled through her. Outlaws sometimes passed through these parts, desperate men with little to lose. But his voice carried no fear, only certainty, and that unsettled her more. Did he know them? Were they following him? She set the bucket down, her throat dry. "If trouble is coming, I need to know why." His jaw tightened, and for a long moment she thought he would give no answer. At last he said, "They hunt us. They think we carry what they want." Her stomach turned. "What is it you carry?" He glanced at his mother, then back at her, his silence heavy as stone. The question died in her mouth. She knew he would not tell her, not yet and maybe not ever. Still, the thought gnawed at her. If men were indeed on the trail, then her home had already become more than a shelter. It was a mark on a map, a place of danger. She had fought so hard to keep her life steady, to keep her walls standing, and now strangers with shadows at their heels had walked straight into it. That day passed under a veil of tension. She went about her chores, but each sound seemed sharper than before: the clatter of the chicken coop door, the groan of the pump, the snap of a branch in the wind. She glanced often at the horizon, half expecting to see riders cresting the ridge. Inside, the Apache son kept to his mother's side, watching over her with an unyielding patience. He spoke little, but when their eyes met, she felt the pressure of unspoken truths pushing between them. By afternoon, she found herself studying the old woman more closely. There was something about her face, worn by age yet marked with dignity, as though she carried the memory of another world within her. The lines etched into her skin told stories of hardship, but also of endurance. And in the quiet moments when the sun smoothed her hair or whispered into her ear, she saw not only devotion but also desperation. That night, the wind rose, rattling the shutters, carrying with it a sound she did not expect, the distant call of horses. Her blood turned cold. She crept to the window, peering out across the darkened land. Shadows moved against the horizon, too many to be chance travelers. She turned, finding him already standing behind her, silent as the dark itself. His hand rested lightly on the bough by his side, and in his eyes burned a calm fire that made her shiver. "They are closer," he said. Her voice was thin. "Why here? Why bring them here?" For the first time, his gaze softened. "Because she cannot ride farther. And you had light in your window." The word struck her harder than any blade could have. Light in her window. She had left the lamp burning, never thinking it would draw anyone but moths. Now it had brought strangers to her door, and with them, danger she had never asked for. The old woman coughed then, a dry, rattling sound, and he moved swiftly to her side. She followed, torn between fear and pity, watching as he lifted her gently, helping her drink from the cup. For a moment, the danger outside faded, replaced by the raw humanity of the scene before her. But when the coughing subsided and the silence returned, the weight of the threat pressed down heavier than before. She sat by the stove, staring into the flames, her mind tangled. She had lived alone for so long, fighting only the land and her own loneliness. Now her world had shifted in a single night, pulling her into a conflict that was not hers. She wanted to send them away, to reclaim the safety of her solitude, but could she? Could she truly push a dying woman and her son out into the cold, with riders closing in behind them? The hours dragged, and with them her unease grew. Sleep would not come. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind felt like a signal. She lay awake, listening for the sound of hooves. Before dawn, she rose and stepped outside, the frost sharp under her boots. The sky was pale, the horizon etched with a faint glow. She thought of the men who might already be out there, waiting, circling like wolves. She thought of the son inside, guarding his mother with a devotion that both unsettled and moved her. And she thought of her own life, carved from silence, now tangled in threads she had not chosen. When she returned, he was awake, his eyes watchful. He studied her as though measuring her resolve. "You could send us away," he said. Her breath caught at the plainness of it. "Would they follow you?" "They would." She swallowed hard, her hands tightening at her sides. "Then sending you away would not keep me safe." He nodded once, as though she had spoken a truth he already knew. The fire crackled. The old woman stirred, and the silence between them deepened once more. She did not know what the day would bring, only that her world had shifted forever. The riders were out there, the danger was real, and her choice to open the door had tied her fate to theirs. And as the sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the frost, she felt it in her bones the storm had only just begun. The day stretched long, every hour pulled tight with unease. The sky was too still, the air too sharp, and the silence outside seemed to hold its breath. She worked as she always did, fetching water, feeding the chickens, patching a section of fence. But her eyes kept straying to the ridge where the trail curved. Each time she glanced up, she half expected to see the dark shapes of riders cresting the horizon. The dread sat in her chest, heavy as stone. Inside the house, the Apache giant kept close to his mother. He moved with a watchful calm, his every action deliberate. When he stepped out to split wood, his axe bit clean through the logs, his strength evident in each swing, yet his eyes never left the distance, as if he expected danger to rise at any moment. She found herself studying him when she thought he wouldn't notice, the way he held his shoulders, the silence that clung to him, the strange sense of purpose that seemed to surround him like a cloak. By evening, the tension had grown unbearable. The old woman on the cot stirred more often, her cough deepening, her voice slipping in and out of fevered whispers. He stayed by her side, murmuring in their tongue, and though she could not understand the words, she understood their weight. They were words of comfort, words of a son unwilling to let go. The sight pulled at her heart, but fear pressed harder. When night came, the air turned colder, the sky thick with stars. She sat near the stove, the flames flickering, her ears straining for any sound beyond the crackle of the fire. That was when it came, the faint echo of hooves. She froze, her heart lurching. He rose at once, moving to the window, his broad frame outlined by the faint light. His face did not change, though his hand rested on the bough at his side. He turned his head slowly, his voice low. "They are here." Her stomach clenched. She crossed the room, peering past him into the darkness. Shadows shifted beyond the fence line, vague forms against the starlit land. Too many to be chance travelers, too close to be harmless. What do they want? She whispered. His gaze did not move from the window. What they always want. What is not theirs? She felt a chill run through her, sharper than the cold air creeping under the door. The old woman stirred then, her frail body trembling as she tried to rise. He knelt by her side, speaking softly, but her eyes darted to the window, wide with fear. Whatever threat lay outside, she knew it too. The woman who owned the house gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She had built her life on solitude, on keeping the world at bay, but now the world had come pounding at her door. And it was no small thing, it was a storm of men, circling like wolves, ready to take whatever they pleased. The night stretched long, filled with waiting. They did not attack, not yet. Instead, they lingered just out of reach, their presence like a weight pressing down on the walls. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a warning. She found herself listening for footsteps, for the scrape of boots on her porch, for the sound of voices cutting through the night. But none came. Only the low murmur of horses shifting in the dark and the endless silence that followed. She could not rest. Neither could he. He stood by the door, bow in hand, his posture steady, his eyes sharp. Hours passed with neither of them speaking, but the unspoken between them grew heavier with every beat of her heart. At last, near dawn, she heard it, the faint crack of a branch outside. Then a voice, low and harsh, carried through the still air. "They're watching us," she whispered, her throat dry. He nodded, his gaze never leaving the dark. "They wait for weakness." Her chest tightened. She thought of her livestock, her meager supplies, everything she had built with her own hands. If these men wanted, they could burn it all to ash. And she thought of him and his mother, two souls she had let inside her walls, who had now tied her fate to theirs. The old woman on the cot let out a soft cry then, her voice quivering in words she did not understand. He bent low, his face taut with worry, his hand gripping hers as if he could anchor her to the earth. The sound tore through the air, and for a moment she feared it would draw the riders straight to their door. But the night held still, save for the restless shifting of horses beyond the fence. The next day was worse. The men remained unseen, but their presence hung thick. She and the Apache worked side by side, though few words passed between them. When she fetched water, he walked with her, scanning the horizon. When she gathered eggs, he stood near, bow in hand. She felt the weight of his watchfulness, the unyielding shield he seemed to place between her and the world. Yet she also felt the danger pressing closer with each breath. As the sun dipped low again, the tension broke. A single shot rang out, the crack of a rifle slicing through the still air. The bullet struck the fence post, splintering wood not 20 steps from the porch. Her heart leapt, her scream caught in her throat. She spun toward him, but he was already moving, shoving her back toward the door. "Inside," he barked, his voice low but fierce. She stumbled in, her body trembling, the sound of her pulse louder than the crack of the gun. He followed, shutting the door hard, his jaw clenched, his eyes alight with a fire she had not seen before. "They test us," he said. Her voice shook. "What do we do?" He glanced at his mother, then back at her. His silence said everything. There was no simple answer. The night fell again, heavy and merciless. The fire burned low, the house wrapped in shadows. Outside, the riders circled, their presence closer, their whispers riding on the wind. Each sound set her nerves aflame, each breath felt stolen. She moved about the room, restless, her hands shaking as she tried to keep busy. But there was no hiding from the truth. The storm was no longer on the horizon, it was at her door. The Apache sat near the window, bow in hand, his gaze fixed on the darkness. His mother lay on the cot, her breath shallow, her frailty a painful reminder of what they risked by staying. The woman of the house sat by the stove, staring into the flames, her mind racing with thoughts she could not untangle. She had lived alone for years, but now every choice, every action, felt bound to the lives of the strangers she had let in. The sound of hooves came again, louder this time, closer, until she swore she could feel the ground tremble beneath them. Voices rose, harsh and mocking, drifting across the night. They were taunting, testing, waiting for fear to break the walls. She clutched the edge of her chair, her heart slamming in her chest. He stood, his shadow tall and unyielding against the glow of the fire, and for a moment she felt the strength of him like a shield. Yet even that strength could not erase the truth. The riders outside would not wait forever. The night held them all captive, the air thick with dread, the promise of violence looming with every passing breath. And as the fire crackled low and the voices grew nearer, she knew the moment of reckoning was upon them, though none could say how it would fall. The storm had come to her doorstep, and the house she had kept so long in silence was about to become the center of a battle she could not escape. Riders lingered outside the homestead, their voices carrying in the cold night air, sharp and cruel as if they were circling prey. Inside, the woman stood frozen by the stove, her body trembling though the fire still burned hot. The Apache stood tall at the window, bow in hand, his figure steady as a rock against the growing storm. His mother lay on the cot, her breath shallow, her frail chest rising and falling with effort, but her eyes were open now, watching her son with a calm that seemed to steady him even in this moment of danger. Then came another shot, this one closer, striking the corner of the house. Splinters flew, and she ducked, her heart racing. He moved without hesitation, pulling her toward the far wall where the shadows kept them hidden. His hand was firm on her arm, not rough but certain. The touch shocked her, not for its strength, but for the strange comfort it gave. For years she had lived untouched, untethered from the world, and now in the thick of danger she felt anchored by his presence. The riders shouted then, demanding he come out, cursing the name they gave him. She didn't know the meaning of the words, but she understood their hate. These men weren't here by chance. They had hunted him and his mother, and her house had become their trap. Hours passed with neither side breaking. The riders called out threats, fired shots into the air, but the Apache never moved from his post, his eyes sharp, his body still as stone. She tended to his mother, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, whispering words she hoped carried comfort, even if they weren't understood. At one point, the old woman's hand closed weakly over hers, and though no words passed, she felt the weight of gratitude in that touch. Toward dawn, the riders grew restless. The sound of horses shifting, men cursing low, drifted through the cold. She sensed their impatience, the hunger for violence pressing at the walls. Fear clawed at her chest, but when she looked to the Apache, she found no fear in him, only resolve. His calm spread through her, quieting the storm inside her long enough for her to breathe. When the attack came, it was sudden. The pounding of boots against the ground, the crash of voices rising together, the shadowed forms surging toward the house. The first man reached the porch, his weight shaking the boards, but before his hand could touch the door, an arrow flew. It struck hard and true, and the man fell without a sound. Another charged, then another, but the Apache's bow sang in the darkness, each arrow loosed with a swiftness that stunned her. He was not wild in his movements, not frenzied. He was measured, each shot deliberate, each step purposeful. She joined in as best she could, clutching the old rifle her husband had left behind. Her hands shook, but when the shadows pressed too close, she pulled the trigger. The blast thundered through the house, the recoil jarring her shoulder, yet the man outside stumbled back into the dirt. For a heartbeat she could not believe what she had done, but when she met the Apache's eyes, she saw no judgment there, only a sharp nod that steadied her. The fight dragged on, the night filled with the clash of violence, the cries of men, the thundering of hooves. Yet slowly the storm began to thin. The riders, broken by their losses and shaken by the strength they faced, pulled back. Curses rang in the air, threats tossed like stones, but one by one their shadows melted into the horizon, their campfire smoke trailing faintly against the dawn. Silence returned at last, but it was not the silence she had known before. It was heavy, trembling, filled with the echo of what had passed. Her hands shook as she lowered the rifle, her breath ragged, her body weary as though the fight had drained every last ounce of strength. The Apache lowered his bow slowly, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. He glanced at her, his eyes dark yet softened in a way she had not seen before. There were no words between them, only the shared knowledge of what they had endured. When she turned to the cot, the old woman lay still, her breathing faint but steady. She knelt at her side, brushing back her silver hair, and the mother's eyes opened, meeting hers with a depth that seemed to hold a lifetime of stories. The woman whispered something in her own tongue, words the rancher woman could not understand, but she felt the meaning all the same: gratitude, relief, the quiet peace of someone who knew. Her son had not stood alone. Days passed, and the land returned to its usual rhythm, though nothing felt the same. The riders did not return. Perhaps they had lost too much, or perhaps they had seen the fire in the giant who had stood against them and thought better of testing it again. Whatever the reason, the prairie grew quiet once more. The woman found herself moving through her days with a new awareness. The silence of her home no longer pressed so heavy. When she fetched water, he walked with her. When she worked the garden, he mended the fence. His presence filled the spaces she had grown used to keeping empty, and though words were few, the silence between them felt different now, shared rather than endured. His mother's health wavered, but she grew calmer in the safety of the house. There were nights when the three of them sat together, the fire crackling, the old woman humming softly in her native tongue, her son listening with a reverence that made the woman's chest ache. She knew then that their bond was unbreakable, carved by hardship and devotion. As winter crept in, snow dusted the land, covering the scars of battle with a clean, quiet blanket. The woman stood at the window one morning, watching the prairie stretch endless and white. For years she had thought of herself as nothing more than a shadow on this land, surviving day by day in silence. But now she knew different. She had opened her door to strangers, and in doing so, she had opened her life to change. The Apache came to stand beside her, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. His eyes were on the horizon, but his presence was steady at her side. "You kept us alive," he said, his voice low but certain. She shook her head, her gaze still on the snow. "We kept each other alive." He gave a small nod, and though no more words passed, she felt the truth settle between them. They had faced the storm together, and though the land would always be harsh, they had found strength in more than just survival. In the weeks that followed, she found herself reflecting often on what had changed. Her solitude had been broken, yet she no longer feared the breaking. The house that once felt like a cage of silence had become a place of shelter, not just for her, but for those who needed it. She realized then that survival was never meant to be a lonely thing. The land tested everyone, but it was not meant to be faced alone. By spring, the prairie bloomed again, wildflowers rising from the earth as though reminding all who lived upon it that beauty could grow even after the hardest storms. She tended her garden with steady hands, the Apache working nearby, his mother resting in the sunlight. Life had not grown easier, but it had grown richer, filled with the weight of shared burdens and the quiet strength of companionship. And in that, she found her peace. The silence was no longer her enemy, for it carried within it the echoes of voices, of laughter, of stories shared by the fire. She had lived alone for years, but no longer. Her door, once shut tight against the world, now stood open to whatever the land might bring. The prairie stretched on, endless and wild, but for the first time in many years, she did not face it with only her own shadow beside her. She faced it with the knowledge that even in the harshest places, even in the loneliest corners of the world, light could be found if you were brave enough to open your door.